My name is Anna Catherine. So I first learned about the impact of communities when I was in high school, but it was not quite in the way that I expected. During the first week of school, my junior year of high school, I arrived on Friday morning to my first period class, and I noticed that Casey wasn't there. Casey and I had met in 5th grade, and we were immediate best friends. The kind that literally went out and got the necklaces that was one heart cut in half that said best friends. We stayed close, and then when we entered high school, our friend groups kind of expanded and diverged, but we were always in each other's lives. About 10 minutes into class, a guidance counselor came to get me and said I needed to go to the office. As we started walking, I asked her what was wrong, and she just said I would find out in a few minutes. A lot of what happened in the days after that are kind of a blur, but I can remember that moment with such visceral clarity. Perhaps you feel this way about some of the best and worst moments of your life. As I walked to the office, I could look in the glass windows, and I saw my mom, and she was standing there, and she was crying. It turned out that Casey had died the night before in her sleep. It was completely unexpected. An autopsy later showed that she had something called long QT syndrome, which is a heart signaling disorder where, if it's undetected, it can lead to sudden death. For the next week, I just felt numb. I was 17, and I'd never lost anyone close to me before. I didn't go to school. I would just sit on the counter in the kitchen at my home with a big Costco-sized jar of animal crackers, and I would eat them, one by one, just staring into a void. I felt so alone, and I knew I wasn't alone. I knew that Casey's parents, her sister, her boyfriend were grieving beyond comprehension, but I still felt that way. Her parents asked those of us who were closest to her to come over to their house and help them talk about the memorial service. And it was there that I met 4 of her other closest friends. We had a pretty big high school, and I hadn't known these women very well before. But as we mourned Casey, we started sharing stories. We laughed about how she loved to re-record answering machine messages. Now, those of you who are young may not remember a time before cell phones, but we used to have landlines and answering machines. But rather than the typical greeting that we weren't home, she liked for us to re-record them with commercial jingles. Particularly, she and I were very keen on the Juicy Fruit commercial jingle, and I remember one day we spent about 2 hours perfecting singing it into our answering machine, much to my mother's chagrin. Her parents also shared her diary with us. She was an avid writer in her diary. And we cried when we read about how she had planned on where she wanted to go to college and how she was convinced she was going to marry her high school boyfriend, Alex, even at that point. I spent most of that year with this group of women, and I realized that as we shared our stories about her, we felt a little bit less alone. There were still really hard days when I would walk down the hall and I'd be sad, or I'd see something that reminded me of her. But then I would see Becca, and she would give me a hug, or I would see Catherine, and she would slide me a note that she wrote me. During my senior year of college, I was an English major, and my thesis was actually about Casey and about losing her. But it was also about, through that loss, how I had created these unexpected friendships and closeness that I might otherwise never have known. Those women are still 4 of my very best friends to this day, 25 years later. In losing her, I realized not only the impact of community, but also the impact of stories and in sharing stories. So much so that that actually became my career. After college, I went to graduate school for journalism. And the first class I took was a sports journalism class. And I realized that I loved storytelling through the lens of sports. Sports, after all, is a microcosm of society. The narratives of athletes, coaches, and teams help us interpret and understand our own cultures and communities. And no matter how famous an athlete is, they all need community. I may never shoot a basketball like Stephen Curry, or not yet, but we both attended Davidson College, and we've both been really shaped by the communities that we encountered there. After graduate school, I went to work for ESPN, the magazine. And of the hundreds of stories that I wrote about athletes, While the big-name athletes like LeBron James or Aaron Rodgers were exciting, to me, it was the power of the lesser heralded athletes whose stories could really connect people. In 2008, I saw a brief news headline about a high school swimmer named Brian. A year before, he'd been in a serious car crash. He'd coded several times in the ER and then suffered a 2-month coma. I reached out to Brian and his family, and I traveled to rural Maryland to learn more about his story. When Brian woke up in the hospital after 2 months of a coma, he couldn't speak. He couldn't move his body. He couldn't even blink his eyelids. But he could hear. And when he heard the doctors telling his parents that he'd probably be a vegetable for life, this once young, vibrant athlete, he was full of despair. He looked at the TV that was playing behind the doctors and his parents, and he saw a broadcast of an Ironman triathlon. And he remembered one goal that he'd written down in middle school: to compete in the Ironman World Championships in Kona, Hawaii. Over a year later, improbably, he did. Not without a lot of suffering and adversity and struggle in between, which was a huge part of his story. A week later, his story that I wrote was published on ESPN.com, and I was sitting in my office scrolling through the reader comments. Now, wiser people will tell you never to read the comments, but writers do it anyway. We can't help it. So as I was scrolling through, I stopped at one. "I'm sitting at my desk crying," the reader had written. "I woke up today, and I didn't feel like being here anymore. But reading Brian's story, seeing his resilience, that has given me hope. Enough hope for another day." I saved that comment. When I started to struggle in my job, when times were difficult, when I faced challenges working in an industry that at the time was 95% male, I remembered those words. And I thought about all the communities, seen and unseen, that were connected through the power of story. I knew that it doesn't always set in right away. For me, it took several years to realize the impact that losing Casey had had on me and on those around her. A year after she passed, the 5 of us went to Figure 8 Island, to a beach house of one of our friends. And on the first night we were there, we all took a small tea light candle, and we walked down to the beach just after dusk, and we found a tidal pool. And we waded in with the water just below our knees, and we lit our candles, and we linked our arms. Candles weren't significant to Casey. They weren't anything that had meant something to her in her life. But as the 5 of us reflected on the past year, we thought about what the light out on the water might represent. How you never know who or what will connect you to someone else. You never know where or when it might happen. But what's important is to be open to it, to look for that light, and to be the light for other people. We didn't know where our journeys would take us. No one in here knows where their story and their journey might take them. And there are times when we sit on a counter and we feel really alone. There are times when we lie in a hospital bed full of despair. But take a moment and look around. Because if you really look around, there is always someone there to help keep you afloat. Thank you.